The game is too easy. The game is too hard. This job was made too simple. No, it was made just right. These are just some examples of oddly opposing opinions that float around when discussing the difficulty of things in Final Fantasy XIV. What is really interesting about that is that all of them can be true simultaneously. While indeed, when presented with two similar problems, it is possible to determine which one is harder and which one is easier, with everyone being mostly in agreement. For the most part, difficulty is subjective. And turns out being really good at something makes that something very easy, while being bad at it makes it very hard. But then, surely, since we all went through approximately the same journey to reach Dawntrail, right? Shouldn't we all have the same point of reference for whether, I don't know, Ihokatomo is easy or hard? Not necessarily, and that is exactly what this video is about. As it turns out, skill and experience doesn't just dump down in your lap simply through investing time in something. If, for instance, you decide to get in shape by running a couple laps around your home once a day, and you do so by running it at exactly the same pace in exactly the same way every day, then while initially you would probably see incredible results as your body gets used to this daily task, at some point your gains, quote unquote, will start to plateau, if not stop altogether. And it is actually very possible this plateau will be reached at a point where you still find this daily exercise somewhat taxing. Arguably, you stopped progressing before your body fully mastered this very specific task. How could that be? The human body is surprisingly resource efficient, when it feels like it anyway, and will in large part only invest resources in developing and maintaining things that are actually relevant and necessary, you could say. Information you hardly ever need is likely to be forgotten or poorly remembered. No, I cannot explain why your brain holds on to that embarrassing memory from 6th grade though. Apparently, that one is important. Similarly, you give your body reason to invest more resources in your muscles by using them more. However, if the body invested more and more resources simply by using muscles, then most of us would have huge legs from all the walking we do. No, what actually happens is that the body invests enough resources to make the task we do manageable enough that it isn't too taxing on us. Just real quick aside here, that's not exactly how it works on a biological level, but in a way, in a practical level, that is basically how it works, in a way. Anyway, those laps around the house initially may have been extremely rough if you were not used to running before, but by the time your gains plateau, while the run isn't trivial, you might not feel like dying once you're done now, and that might apparently be good enough. At this point, you might develop more by trying to run the same distance but faster, or running a longer distance, or alternatively working on your technique or something. Now, the way this relates to the difficulty of a game like Final Fantasy XIV is that, to start, this game has a wide selection of different difficulty content, from Under the Armor all the way to something like Howling Blade from M8S. And putting any two duties side by side, most of us can probably agree on which one is harder and which one is easier, with some exceptions where experience with one duty might make it subjectively easier than the other. But when we stop putting them side by side and just focus on one thing is when things get really complicated, as depending on who you ask, the Dawntrail leveling dungeons, and maybe even some of the max level ones, may be considered trivial, quote unquote, or, quote, so hard I'd rather leave, unquote. Although, that one is a bit extreme. But how could that be? Well, I guess it should be obvious, but given some of the common discourse about Final Fantasy XIV, and honestly, games in general these days, it might not be. The player that finds the Dawntrail leveling dungeons anywhere from trivial to perhaps average difficulty likely spends a considerable amount of time with harder content than that. One could say they ran longer laps around the house, or maybe started running somewhere else, and maybe even worked on their technique. Alternatively, these players chose to optimize this difficulty of content by doing it as efficiently as possible. They kept running the exact same laps, but faster and faster, perhaps also worked on their technique to make that possible. Meanwhile, the players that found the duties hard, or outright impossible, may have instead chosen to just run those laps at the same pace every time, and didn't really care to explore beyond that. It is also possible that once it started to feel a bit easier, they relaxed a bit and started skipping days, or ran less laps, or ran slower. To be clear, your first time in a duty is almost certainly always going to be your hardest experience with it, as you don't know it yet, and finding it challenging to do there makes sense. And I'm not trying to put anyone down by saying if you find these kinds of duties hard, it's just because you're slacking or something. Some people also just find certain things harder to do, but it is a possibility that that is actually the reason. But it also might not be. The idea is that to improve at something once you have reached a plateau, you kinda need to give it more than 100% of what you normally do. Lift bigger weights or do more reps, run longer or faster. In essence, one could say that you need to get sweatier with whatever it is that you're doing, which also means it will require most or all of your attention to do it. If you exclusively run dungeons mostly autopilot while mostly watching a show on your other monitor, then you're probably not going to notice or care about any major or minor improvements you could make to do better. If you tank dungeons pulling only one pack at a time and barely ever using defensive cooldowns, then it requires you to choose to do more than that, because the game won't randomly make you pull 2 packs, or forcibly get you to press some defensive cooldowns, as long as what you're currently doing clears the duty. If you heal by just casting Cure 1 repeatedly, as long as that works and you get to clear the duty, you won't have much reason to try anything else. Aside from choosing to. If you just press your simplest attack buttons to deal damage, as long as that works and you clear the duty, you won't have much reason to need to press all those flashy cooldowns, unless you choose to. And that is kind of the key here. A large part of the MSQ-related duties in Final Fantasy XIV can be beaten by doing just the bare minimum. That is good enough. Especially if there's like other players around you that might be trying a bit harder than you as well. And the human mind is kinda lazy at times. If you don't ask for more, then why give more? Sure, many players will choose to do more because they think it is fun. Or maybe they value the potential time saved by bringing it a bit harder. But if we get used to running the same 2 or 3 expert-led dungeons that we severely overgear for over half a year, turns out a new dungeon that you are not overgearing and barely know will seem much harder because the normal that the expert roulettes placed you at meant that this new dungeon actually requires 150% of your effort instead of 100%, until you reach that one's level. Which, in other words, means that part of the motivation of pushing yourself harder in supposedly easy content is that it prepares you better for when content actually is harder. It maintains your gamer muscles, as it were. Which leads us to the other side of the table. Let's say that you do these daily laps around your home at this strict pace every day, but you have a friend who is actually a marathon runner. One day they happen to visit before your daily run, and of course they decide to join you for it. As it turns out, while you're happy, well spent after your daily run, they're left somewhat confused as to why this is where the run ends. To them, it was barely started. It is, of course, also possible they used the opportunity to practice technique, but that is maybe a bit of a different story. To the player that regularly savage raids the current raid tier, beats it, and re-clears it every week, leveling duties, whether it be Hyukatumu or Sastasha, both might seem like baby mode relative to what they're used to doing. So far down that, while sure, they can probably recognize that Hyukatumu is significantly more complex than Sastasha, in an average group, neither as much as moves the needle for them. A less severe, yet similar version of this also happens with most raid tiers. Typically, the first boss of a raid tier is easier than the last boss of the previous raid tier, which of course means that if the specific player's new plateau is, say, M4S Wicked Thunder, then even if certainly M5S Dancing Green challenges you in a different way to M4S, M5S feels much easier to a player that previously cleared M4S than a player who is stepping into Savage for the first time. And the way this becomes a problem, one could say, is because a significant amount of players that get into Savage raiding do so to get challenged, to have reason to improve. As long as the game gives them a justification to give it 110%, they will give it 110%, allowing them to raise their plateau higher than what that specific fight asked of them. And then, when the next raid tier requires either less than that, or even just as much, or maybe only slightly more, then this player that was pushing it every week now feels like the game's difficulty has stagnated, regardless of whether it has or not. What makes this balance difficult to strike in a long-running game, like an MMO, like 14, is that at some point, the best players will reach a pinnacle where they start to optimize to a degree where they explore the finest of details of the game. Frame-specific optimization, exact latency differences, optimizing milliseconds of gameplay. At least on a theoretical level, but sometimes on a practical level too. If you continue to try and challenge them every raid tier, you may lose sight of making content fun to do in the pursuit of making it hard to do. I've been told that for a lengthy period of time, World of Warcraft raid bosses had a tendency to accompany almost every mechanic with so-called swirlies, quote-unquote. I'll explain that in a moment. This is probably an exaggeration, but when it reaches the point where it feels like every boss does it, you know it's a running theme. Swirlies are telegraph indicators that say a circle AoE will strike here, and they typically target player locations. So imagine any Savage boss fight you have ever done, and imagine that in addition to whatever's happening, all players in a raid have a medium-sized circle AoE spawn under them, for every mechanic. That would definitely make a lot of fights harder, but is that fun? On top of this, if every raid tier is designed to be significantly harder than the last, it can reach a point where onboarding new Savage Raiders just becomes impossible. Imagine if your only option to train up to running a marathon is to either run a couple laps around your home at a strict pace in a set amount of time each day, or run the whole marathon. And that's obviously a ridiculous comparison, but the relative difficulty probably gets the point across. And even with this in mind, arguably, the chasm between the expectations to the player for beating a regular dungeon and beating, say, a Savage boss is so gigantic already that there is easily space for difficulty in between in the form of extremes. And arguably, the chasm between regular difficulty duties and extremes is also almost, I'd say, big enough that there could be space for one more difficulty between those. And this makes perfect sense if the target audience of regular difficulty content like dungeons, includes the player that just wanted to run a few laps around their home at a strict pace, or in other words, a player that just wanted to progress and wasn't too concerned about massive improvements. On the other hand, due to how off the main path extremes and savage content is, the target audience here may be more focused on the players willing to put in more work. It probably then makes sense why this chasm has appeared. To go back a bit to the initial discussion about investing time in something, focusing in a bit more on technique, you could have invested so much time and energy into a specific type of task that one might consider you a master of the craft, and yet still do it wrong in some aspects, even with all the practice. As it turns out, practice alone is not always enough, as you might master doing it wrong in the first place, leading you to perform much worse than you could have if you had done it right from the beginning. Maybe you would have improved at running faster if you had learned a better running technique. Maybe you could have lifted heavier weights if you had learned a better technique for that. You could have done 1,000 duties as a healer, and based on your own experience alone, determined that attacking just isn't needed. In fact, you may even have beaten savage bosses with that mindset, and yes, once teams get some gear, it is possible to beat some savage bosses with the healers not attacking at all. But we can both agree it would be easier if they attacked when they had the space to. To wrap up this discussion a bit, with a bit of a left turn, what can make it difficult for Final Fantasy XIV to appeal to everyone is that the game has players of all skill levels, of all levels of investment, of all levels of laziness, of all levels of interest, of all levels of nostalgia. Whenever a job receives a major change, it usually streamlines the job more, making it more intuitive, but by extension also making it easier. Take Black Mage for instance. The job still is above average in complexity amongst the jobs in the game, but relative to what the Black Mage mains were used to before Dawntrail, this is a marathon runner taking a few laps around a home, or it at least feels that way. Whenever a new raid tier or a new ultimate comes out and it isn't harder than the last, regardless of whether it is because it is difficult in a different way or not, the players that went above and beyond to beat the last one may feel a bit bored, especially if they came along for the challenge in particular. Similarly, when a new job is added to the game with some complex feature in its rotation, of course some portion of the player base may ask for it to be made simpler because they like not doing more than that. When a mandatory duty is tougher than normal, it hits these players harder because they settled into the status quo, which has now changed. Which is something Dawntrail has seemingly done a few times, as both the leveling dungeons, Stray Burrow Deadwalk, and, as I understand, the newest dungeon from 7.3 all are enough of a difficulty spike that it was significant to some players. I hope you found this discussion about mastery, with some connection to real-life stuff, interesting, and maybe made you think of things from a slightly different angle. Whatever the case, I would love to hear about your perspective on this topic in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, many times throughout the game's lifespan, a job has had a particularly complex rotation. An example of this included Monk's Tornado Kick rotation. Back then, the Monk had to build their attack speed buff, one stack at a time, by using combo finishers, and Tornado Kick, while dealing tremendous damage, cleaned out all those stacks, making it a fantastic fight ender. Some players, though, found a way to effectively make use of it as a rotational option, and while slightly stronger than not using it, the rotation was considered so complicated that many players simply didn't bother.